Today in PLS 510, we're going to take up the subject of perennial warm season grasses for Kentucky. So let's get started. These are going to be the important perennial warm season grasses that we will talk about during this particular segment of PLS 510. The native grasses, switchgrass, big blue stem, Indian grass, and eastern gamma grass, and we'll touch briefly on broom sedge, which is also a native warm season grass in Kentucky. And we will talk a little bit about Bermuda grass as the primary introduced perennial warm season grass that we grow in Kentucky, both the hybrid types and the seeded types. If you compare the natives versus the introduced warm season grasses, or natives versus Bermuda grass in this case, the natives are palatable. They require rotational stocking to persist. They are tall growing bunch grasses as opposed to the very low growing Bermuda grass. Their tall bunchy growth is protective for wildlife, especially birds and rabbits. Bermuda grass, on the other hand, is very low growing, very dense, and does not allow for very much of a pathway for birds to run through to seek insects or to nest, or for rabbits to have cover from predators. The natives have a greater yield per pound of nitrogen fertilizer applied than Bermuda grass. Now, Bermuda grass has higher soil fertility requirements, including that of nitrogen, but Bermuda grass can provide some very exceptional yields, but it does require very high levels of nitrogen, even more than a couple hundred units of nitrogen per acre per year. The major benefits from perennial warm season grasses are seen here. And so if you think about putting together a full season grazing system in Kentucky, we are going to need some species that grow well during midsummer. And perennial warm season grasses fill that niche very, very well. And let's go through these benefits. These grasses complement cool season grasses. And that means it gives us, or gives the livestock, a break from the toxic tall fescue that forms the bulk of Kentucky pastures. Another benefit, besides just their productivity during summer, is it gives the cool season grass a rest during hot weather, and that does a couple of things. First of all, it lets us leave a residual height and keep the crowns of the cool season grass cool. And it also keeps the grass competitive, and it holds down weeds in cool season grass stands. But it also allows that cool season grass to rest for an accumulation of fall growth, which is we call it stockpiling, but it's one of the characteristics, particularly of tall fescue, that makes it very, very useful to us. When we have a true summer component to our pasture system, it will let that tall fescue rest in summer, which is good for the plant, and it will also let it accumulate growth into the fall, which is good for the later part of the growing season. Even after we've gotten into temperatures that are not conducive to growth, the tall fescue yield will be there. These warm season grasses are high yielding. They produce high animal gains, both on an individual basis, but also on a per acre basis. And as we've said before, they're responsive, very responsive to nitrogen fertilization. Now, they have some disadvantages, and I'm going to focus primarily on the disadvantages of the native grasses here, because they have some very unique disadvantages that can be addressed, but yet they are also barriers to their adoption. And probably front and center of any discussion about native warm season grasses is the area of establishment. These grasses have been very difficult for us to get reestablished in Kentucky. Now, there have been individuals like the like Roundstone Seed Company down in the Hart County or South Central area of Kentucky that have been able to fine-tune establishment and really be successful in their establishment of native warm season grasses, and it's helped us tremendously in reestablishing these grasses across Kentucky. But native warm season grasses are hard to establish because their seed tends to have a lot of natural dormancy. That they also are not very easy to handle as a group. There are some that are, but most of them are very fluffy and just do not flow well through traditional equipment. They typically have very low seedling vigor. They are slow to emerge, and we still have few weed control options, although we have some. You have to list cost of establishment, both in the cost of seed, which can be very expensive, and also the fact that it may take 2 years before it becomes a productive stand. It does require, the natives do require, rotational grazing and a period of rest in the fall in order to persist. They are very sensitive to close grazing, and some management schemes are going to even point you towards doing prescribed burns, which are somewhat difficult to carry off and not very friendly to your neighbors and cause a lot of consternation among rural fire departments, and in certain years for very, very good reason. Unique to the natives is the idea that we establish, or that it is very common, and in fact you should, buy seed on a pure live seed basis. And we'll talk more about what that means later, but it's abbreviated by PLS. And we'll talk about some of the story about Bermuda grass a little later in this particular segment. We talked about high yields, but I want to connect the point of high yields per unit of nitrogen applied. And I said earlier that the native grasses are going to be more responsive per pound of N applied. This happens to be data from the University of Kentucky in 2009 for big blue stem Indian grass, eastern gamma grass, and switchgrass, which had an average, the yields for those ran from about 3.9 tons per acre up to 5.3 on only 60 pounds of N per acre per year. Compare that to tall fescue that year, which had a range, or had averaged 3 tons per acre, but it took 180 units of nitrogen to achieve that yield. So clearly makes the point here that native grasses are more responsive per unit of nitrogen applied, at least in that 60 to 180 pound range. So there, you can see those points highlighted. This is a photograph of big blue stem and Indian grass on a reclaimed mine land site in eastern Kentucky, making the point that with good management, native warm season grasses can grow even on poor soils. We get good summer gains on native warm season grasses. This is 3 different studies. The top 2 are in Tennessee. The third one is that reclaimed mine site in eastern Kentucky. The average daily gains ranged from about 1.4 to 2.3 with gains per acre between 113 and 200 pounds per acre. So you can see that the Kentucky site, on the mine site, had gains equivalent to those in Tennessee with Angus versus Holstein Jersey heifers. Now I want to make the point here, it looks like the Kentucky site has a disadvantage in terms of gain in terms of beef per acre, but average daily gain is a function of what kind of quality is present. The gain in beef per acre is a reflection of the quantity present. So what that really means when you see that beef gain per acre is less at the mine site is that overall the productivity on that site is lower than at the other sites. Native warm season grasses, well managed, can be very long-lived. This is a 21-year-old stand of switchgrass, and the picture that's at the bottom is July the 19th at 3 o'clock and 90 degrees, and these animals are out there actively grazing switchgrass at that time. typically at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in our cool season species, particularly tall fescue, the livestock are in the shade. There are other benefits to the native grasses, including deep roots, which are certainly equating to soil health, percolation, and all of the beneficial soil traits that we're after on a site. And if you think back to the Dust Bowl days of the prairie grasses of the Great Midwest, then those prairie grasses were holding the topsoil together. And you can even now today, you can go to sites and find areas where the grassland has transitions over into cropland, or where it's been cropped, and you can find very large drops in the height of the soil because the grasses have held the soil when a crop system lost it to erosion, primarily wind erosion. And native warm season grasses are also very good wildlife habitat. This is a photograph, an aerial photograph of some native warm season grass locations in a Kentucky quail study. And if you look at the text at the bottom, it says 63% of the nests are in or on the edge of the native warm season grasses. So they have been able to, in this area, which is down near it's in Madison County, they have been able to reintroduce or to bring back in Kentucky quail into these areas by having native warm season grasses present. So this brings us to the close of this segment, the first segment of the perennial warm season grasses in PLS 510. When we come back, we will complete the lecture on perennial warm season grasses. So until then.